Hey BookTube, it's Lindsay again, and I decided to do the nonfiction book tag, top 10 nonfiction books. I saw this originally on Tilly's Shelf channel, and this went around a little while ago. I think it was created by Lukash at Totally Pretentious, but I'm not sure. And I just thought, since I'm new to BookTube, I would give sort of a rundown of some of my top 10 favorite nonfiction books. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but this is just some of the books that I have enjoyed over the course of the time that I've been reading nonfiction. So we're just going to go ahead and get into it. It runs the gamut of types of books, from history to nature to genetics to memoir slash biography, the whole nine yards. And I've left out quite a few that I could have included in here. These are just ones I grabbed off my shelf as I was thinking about the books that I wanted to include in this tag. And the first one that I want to talk about was my favorite nonfiction book of 2018. And I live in Kansas, if you didn't know. Wizard of Oz jokes, do not. Um, and one of the books that came out in 2018 was by Sarah Smarsh, who is a Kansas author. And she was born and raised in Kansas, and that book is Hurtland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. And Sarah, in this book, writes about being poor. Sarah grew up in, or on a farm in sort of central Kansas in the Wichita area. However, her childhood was a rough one. They didn't have a lot of money. Her parents had issues of their own. And so Sarah looks into detail about the working class and what it's like to work hard and yet still not have money, and how that stigmatizes you as you go through life. For instance, she talks about carrying her school supplies in a plastic bag because she didn't have a backpack. She talks about when she went to college and how she felt like an outsider or an imposter because she didn't have the language of the university that a lot of her classmates did. And this book resonated with me because even though I did not grow up with sort of the traumatic abuse and neglect that Sarah did, I also felt like this was a book about my people. Many of the people that I grew up around were working class, they were farmers, and they worked jobs that they had to, not because they wanted to. And I feel extremely lucky in my job as a university instructor that I get to live a life of the mind. Because I don't have a PhD, I may not get paid as well as I would like, but that's another story entirely about the treatment of adjuncts. However, I do feel lucky that I have been able to have a job that I truly do enjoy, and I'm not like, a laborer that is working a job just to barely scrape by. I mean, I do barely scrape by sometimes, but again, I'm doing stuff that I feel is valuable. And so this book really spoke to me. It resonated with me on so many levels. And in April of 2019, Sarah came and spoke at my university town for part of a writing workshop that was going on. And so I got to meet Sarah and have her sign the book. You can see here. And so that was really awesome. And I even had her take a picture with me. She humored me. And she put it up on her social media account. So that was pretty cool. So yes, this is one of my favorite, most cherished books. You can see all the tabs. And Sarah is actually coming out with another book later this year about Dolly Parton's songs and the women who lived them. And the best news I have had today was that NetGalley approved me for an arc of that book. So, yes. I guess NetGalley didn't approve me, the publisher did, but through NetGalley, I was approved for an arc of that book. So I am very excited for that. I was gonna like message Sarah and see if she would send me a copy if I didn't get approved through NetGalley. But Hurtland by Sarah Smarsh. If you grew up in a rural farming community and your parents didn't make a lot of money and you grew up around working class people and you know what it's like to live that sort of a life as like a working class individual, I think this book will really speak to you if you have had that background. So yeah, Hurtland is definitely like the number one book on this list because it's just so personal and intimate to me. Alright, let's see. From there we'll go on to science, specifically genetics. So one of the first books I read about genetics was The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee. This book like blew my mind. I couldn't put it down. I absolutely adored every second of it. I found it fascinating. I never thought when I was younger, like say in high school, that I would ever care that much about genetics. Never thought that science would be my thing, especially considering that I was more into, English, history, music, all of those types of classes rather than the science classes. And so discovering how fascinating I find genetics and the fact that for the most part I understand the fundamentals of it was awesome. And this book really breaks it down and shows you, the history of genetics and how we have learned about our genetic code over the course of time that scientists have been studying. And like I said, it's an amazing book to read, especially if you want to get sort of a beginning grasp on genetics. Of course, it talks about, like Gregor Mendelssohn and his pea plants as he's trying to figure out the different, genetic varieties. And it goes on from there to now when we have things like CRISPR and the genetic, genome and all of that. So this is a fantastic book, and I highly, highly recommend it if you have an interest in genetics and in learning more about how we're put together, what our basic genes are. It's really cool. The other book that's related to genetics is by Adam Rutherford, and it is A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, the Human Story Retold Through Our Genes. And this was actually my second favorite nonfiction book in 2018, along with Hurtland. Vastly different books, but also fascinating. So in A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, Rutherford goes into the backstory of our ancestors and talks about how our genetics go back further and further into the past and how we are related to various types of Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, so on and so forth, right? Because they are different types of beings. We weren't always considered Homo sapiens like we are now. And also talking about how we have evolved over time and what this tells us about humanity based on our genetics. And again, just a fascinating read. The history and the stuff that you learn about regarding, our closest ancestors and the evolutionary track that we have taken it's just absolutely fascinating. I couldn't put this book down. I absolutely loved it so much, and I felt like I learned a lot from it. And yeah, definitely a reason why it was one of my favorite nonfiction reads a couple years ago, because it was just so engaging to read, and I learned so much about our history and ancestors and DNA and evolution and everything like that. So highly, highly recommend this book. If any of those things sound interesting to you, it's just fabulous. Alright, we're going to move into religion now. So the first book that I have for my nonfiction religion books that I really love is Born of a Woman, A Bishop Rethinks the Virgin Birth and the Treatment of Women by a Male-Dominated Church. And this is by John Shelby Spong. when I was in graduate school, my friend Carrie, who I will probably mention a lot on this channel, she turned me on to John Shelby Spong, who was a bishop in Newark, New Jersey, and he has written many books. I have most of them. Not quite all of them, but most of them. And he has a biography that I read several years ago where he talks about his journey with religion. And Bishop Spong, in his books, he has a very, what some would call, liberal perspective on religion. He does not take the Bible literally, and he also talks a lot about the treatment of LGBTQ people in the church, the treatment of women, all of those types of things he goes and talks about. And this is one of those books that talks about the treatment of women and looks at the treatment of women through the Virgin Mary. And he sort of dissects that story and uses that story to have a commentary on how women have been treated in a male-dominated church. And it's absolutely fascinating. My friend let me borrow a copy of this book when I was in graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, I rarely ever read for pleasure or for myself. Everything that I read was for my classes or for my thesis. And the day that she loaned me this, I shirked everything I was supposed to be doing for school, and I sat on my couch and I read this cover to cover, pretty much in one sitting. And I was hooked. And I've read almost everything that he's written since. And I adore this man. He is elderly now. He had a stroke. I'm not sure how good his health is, but he's just an amazing human being, an amazing writer. And I am so glad that he has these books. Even though I identify as an atheist, I really appreciate his perspective on things. And Bishop Spong calls himself a believer in exile, meaning that he feels that while he still believes in God, his version of religion is not necessarily accepted by a lot of people. And so that's why he says he's a believer in exile, because his beliefs don't line up with what the church necessarily wants people to believe, right? So I love Bishop Spong. I highly recommend his books if you are in any way interested in a more liberal theology, for lack of a better term, and really looking into the stories in the Bible and rethinking them and looking at them in a different light. And he does that so incredibly well. And I also recommend his biography that he wrote, or autobiography, which is interesting too, because he didn't always start out being so like liberal and inclusive, but he came to that over time. And so his journey is fascinating. His books are fascinating. I could go on for days about this man and his books, but my favorite of his is definitely Born of a Woman. My other favorite religious writer and scholar is Karen Armstrong. My favorite book by her is A History of God, the 4,000-year quest of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Karen Armstrong is another one of those authors who I have read a lot of her books, but this one has really stuck out to me. Again, I feel like I'm going to mention grad school a lot in my videos because it was a very profound time for me. But again, when I was in grad school, I took a class where we read Paradise Lost by John Milton. And our professor in the discussions with Paradise Lost, I don't remember how it all came about, she actually mentioned this book and brought it up. And so I checked it out from the university library because I was curious. And I read it, I loved it. I even talked about it with my mom. And she was halfway interested in it, but she's not as big a reader as I am by any means, so she never read it. And then when I worked at Half Price Books, I picked up this copy. It might not have been when I worked there, but at some point. And this is exactly what it says on the title. Basically, it's a history of God and why does he exist, and how have these three monotheistic religions shaped and altered the conception of who or what God is. And it's really fascinating. And I think if you're in any way interested in religion or the concept of God, regardless of whether or not you believe in a God of any sort, regardless of whether or not you're religious at all, this is still a really fascinating book to read. And Karen Armstrong is definitely a really good religious scholar and author and writer. And she has a lot of other books that if you like this one, you should check out as well. Moving on now to some nature writing. I only have one book in this, and it's one I read a long time ago, so I don't remember much about it, but I did really like it at the time, and I should definitely give it a reread. And that is Desert Solitaire, A Season in the Wilderness by Edward Abbey. When I was in undergrad, I took a nature writing class, and this was one of the books that we were assigned to read. And we also read like Annie Dillard and it's escaping me who else we read. But anyway, Desert Solitaire was definitely my favorite book that we read in that class. And it's essentially Edward Abbey writing about his time in a national park in the wilderness. He lives out there, and I think he kind of works as a ranger, if I remember right. But it's a really fascinating book, and his experiences of living out in the wilderness. And he doesn't have access to a lot of the like conveniences that that we all enjoy for the most part. And so, yeah, this was a good book, and I really need to reread it so I can remember more of what it's about, because I don't. And I have several other books from Edward Abbey. I have his letters and postcards, and then I also have a nonfiction, or not a nonfiction. I have a fiction book of his that I have never read, and I need to, because it's been sitting on my shelves for ages. But yeah, this was definitely, like I said, one of my favorite books that we read in nature writing, and I highly recommend it, and I really need to reread it. Okay, let's see. Okay, we're going to go to a book I read again in an undergrad class, and that is They Marched into Sunlight, War and Peace, Vietnam and America, October 1967, by David Marinis. So I took a class on Vietnam when I was in undergrad. I had two minors. I was a history minor and a creative writing minor, and one of the history classes that I took for my minor was a class on the Vietnam War. My dad was in Vietnam. He was an interrogator, and so this is a tough topic for me. But anyway, this was a really good book. We were assigned a lot of books to read for Vietnam, but our instructor or our professor, he didn't go over all of them in detail, which pained me, because it was like we were assigned all of these books, but we never really talked about them in class. But this book I absolutely loved. I couldn't put it down. It has different perspectives. It talks about the soldiers over in Vietnam who were fighting the war. It talks about the protesters who were protesting against the war. And it also talks about what was happening in Washington on the political side during the Vietnam War. And so it has these various chapters that focus on these different aspects of Vietnam. And again, I couldn't put this down. It was fascinating. Some of the political stuff that goes on in Washington, I got a little bogged down in. But a lot of the other stuff I was really interested in, especially the protests, because a lot of stuff happened with those. And considering this was, the era that my parents were coming of age in, and that my dad was a part of this war in just horrible ways, it rang very true to me. And my professor that taught this class, Dr. Lovett, he was also in the Vietnam War, and he was also in military intelligence, like my dad. So, yeah, very, very personal book for me because of my relationship to the Vietnam War, even though I wasn't alive at the time. But it definitely changed my dad as a person, and he would be very different, and I probably wouldn't exist if he hadn't have been in Vietnam. So, yeah, They Marched into Sunlight. My other history book is The Mystery of the Most Famous Chessmen in the World and the Women Who Made Them, Ivory Vikings, by Nancy Marie Brown. And in 2009, I went to England for a study abroad trip. And while I was in England, we went to the British Museum, of course. and they had the Lewis chessmen exhibit. Um, and I was absolutely fascinated by these chessmen. I don't know why. I don't even know how to play chess, but these little chess figurines made out of ivory really just fascinated me, and I wanted to know more about them. And so when I discovered there was a book about them, I was like, I need to read that now. And I actually just read this not that long ago. I think it was last year. And I really enjoyed it because not only does it talk about how these chessmen were created and like how they were discovered, but it also talks a lot about like Vikings and Norse myth and all of that. So there was a lot of information in here, not just about these chess pieces, but about the culture surrounding the Vikings, which I found absolutely fascinating. So I would highly recommend this. And if you're ever in England, you should go to the British Museum and look at all of the exhibits and also check out the Lewis chessmen because they're really, really cool. And then my last two books are like nerdy literature, English sort of books, sort of on the philosophy side of things or the rhetoric side of things. In grad school, my thesis focused on rhetoric, and one of the books that I read, I think it was in grad school I read this, I don't remember, was rereading the Sophists, Classical Rhetoric Refigured. And I'm fascinated by the Sophists and by classical rhetoric in general. So this was part of why my thesis was on rhetoric. And the Sophists were essentially teachers in ancient Greek, and they were not very well liked because they, horror of horrors, they charged to teach people, right? They charged money. You had to pay to learn from them. And then they were also demonized by Aristotle because he didn't believe in their version of what was the truth. And so this looks at the Sophists and classical rhetoric, and it gives new historical insights about the Sophists and various things of that nature. And again, this is another one I need to reread. I've read it several times, but it's been several years, so the details are escaping me. But again, it was one of those books when I first read it, I was like, yes. This is like the kind of thing I just nerd out over. And yeah, I highly recommend this book if you're into rhetoric and philosophy, because it ties all of that stuff together so very well. And the Sophists are just interesting anyway, given that they were despised, but yet, you know, they weren't terrible people. And so, yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite nonfiction books. And probably one of the, like, ones no one would ever have heard of necessarily, unless you're, like, in a specialized English literature program or rhetoric program. But yeah, so, and then the last book is the one I read when I was in undergrad. Undergrad. I think. Or was it grad school? I don't know. They all blur together. And this is The Alphabet versus the Goddess, The Conflict Between Word and Image by Leonard Shallan. And it's been a long time since I've read this, so in order for me to best explain it, I'm just going to read a little bit of it to you from the front flap. So making remarkable connections across a wide range of subjects, including brain anatomy and function, anthropology, history, and religion, Shallan argues that with the advent of literacy, the very fact of reading an alphabet reinforced the brain's left hemisphere. Linear, abstract, predominantly masculine at the expense of the right, holistic, concrete, visual, feminine. This shift upset the balance between men and women, and it initiated the disappearance of goddesses, the abhorrence of images, the decline of women's social and political status, and a long reign of patriarchy and misogyny. The Alphabet versus the Goddess tracks the correlation between the rise and fall of literacy and the changing status of women in society, mythology, and religion throughout European history, and in other cultures as well. So, yes, it looks at the advent of writing and how this contributed to the way women were viewed in society. and it was an absolutely mind-blowing book when I read it at the time. I did a presentation in one of my rhetoric classes over a chapter in this book where they talk about the advent of the printing press and also how that tied into the Reformation with Martin Luther. And so, yeah, this is definitely a fascinating read, and I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in literacy and the advent of writing, and also in how that has affected the role of women in society. So that was 10 nonfiction books. I hope you enjoyed this tag, and let me know in the comments if you are interested in any of these books or if you would like to read any of them, and if you have read any of them, what you thought of them. Also, please subscribe if you are enjoying the videos on my channel. And I will talk to you again soon. Thanks, BookTube.